For everyone trickling in, we are reviewing the U.S. Poker Open main event. It was a $50,000 buy-in tournament. This is day 2, so we're nowhere near the money. I believe there are 12 players remaining or 11 players remaining, something like that, with 5 getting paid. That may sound like it's close to the money, but the tournament probably only had 30 or 40 or 50 people. So nowhere near the money, and we are going through these text hand histories. I know some of you don't like the text hand histories, but you will learn. We're not about aesthetics. All right. We're continuing to play. Tollerine, Ben Tollerine, very good player, raises a 16K with Queen 7 of diamonds on the button. Cats, who must be Carry Cats. Let's fast forward just a bit on my end. It is Carry Cats. He, with 92K, calls the big blind with 4-2 suited. This may look a little bit splashy with 4-2 suited, but I think it's probably fine. One thing you'll learn if you study with a lot of the solvers is that it's fine to defend your big blind quite wide, especially as you are shallow. And that's because if you make any pair or any draw, it's often just good enough to get it in. Let's see. Muggy says, could you maybe try to show a bluff to value ratio on each street in the next hand? Well, we'll see where we get into this. I'm not trying to do a bunch of math with a calculator. Well, maybe we'll make it really simple for you, but here we are on this flop, right? Flop comes King 10-9. Tollerine bets 10K into 42. Hello, Ghost of M, welcome. All right, 10K into 42. First off, this is just basic math stuff here. 10, he's betting 10 to win 42. So you take the your bet size, 10, divided by the pot you're going to win plus your bet, so that is 52. Tollerine needs this bluff to succeed 19% of the time to profit, right? That's how often he needs to profit. Now, next question. How often does Cats need to defend to be unexploitable? Well, that number is 10 divided by what the total pot's going to be if he calls, which is, well, the minimum defense frequency is the opposite of how often the bluff needs to succeed. So if the bluff needs to succeed 20%, Cats needs to defend 80% of the time, assuming he's trying to be unexploitable. But, very important concept. The book that this came from they forgot one big point here, and that is that Tollerine has a massive range advantage. When you have a massive range advantage in Tollerine's shoes, Cats should be folding more often than minimum defense frequency. It's okay to fold more often than, quote unquote, you should, and that's because you're going to lose most of the time when you're calling. You have huge reverse implied odds, and you're going to realize your equity poorly. So this is a spot where Tollerine knows he has a range advantage, mainly because Carry didn't shove pre-flop, right? Notice Carry is playing very short. He's going to shove most of his best hands. So when he's calling, it should be mostly garbage type stuff. And so Tollerine's setting up a small bet on the flop with the idea of maybe continuing to barrel on later streets. And this is something you see almost no one do, and something I've been trying to implement into my game of using these tiny bets when I expect to have a very, very big range advantage. And this is a spot where you should have a big range advantage. Let's see. So yes, welcome Ghost of M. Welcome everyone. Let's see. 4-2 suited is too loose. I do not think it's too loose. That is a concept that a lot of people have wrong. 4-2 suited is not a good hand, don't get me wrong. It is going to realize his equity poorly as well. But it's probably going to be close enough to justify calling, given Cats is starting to get somewhat short. Something I learned from David Peters a long time ago is that when you're in the big blind facing small raises, you can defend really wide when you're shallow. Just because you're putting in one big blind to try to win the 4 or 5 big blind pot. So you need to only win 20% of the time right there. And then you get to realize your equity very well because any pair is often good enough. You do have to be smart about it though. Say it comes King, Queen, 2. If Tollerine bets, you need to be able to fold, which is something a lot of people have not quite mastered. You have to get very good at playing shallow stacked. All right, next hand. Tollerine raises 16K with King, Jack of Hearts and the hijack. My note here says loose. This is quite loose. The hands that you do want to open with when you are raising looser are the big suited hands, or suited hands in general, like Jack 8 suited, Queen 9 suited. King 7 suited is one I don't typically open, but sure, you know, if people are folding too often, why not? Marchese calls big blind with 6-4 offsuit. So this is something I've been trying to cut out of my game to some extent. 6-4 does quite poorly in the big blind. I mentioned this earlier that 7-5, I think it was 7-5 or something like that. It's a hand that you can defend. Don't get me wrong. You can defend it. But it does not realize its equity very well at all, especially against someone who is just a world-class player, like best in the world. So I think it's probably fine to be a hair tighter than normal, just because you can realize even less equity if your opponent's going to play very close to perfectly. All right, flop comes 7-4-4. It's a pretty good board for Marchese. All right, Tallerine bets tiny again, 12 into 42. A lot of people are going to be shocked by these tiny bets. Like, why would you bet so small? You're giving him a good price to outdraw you. Well, because often they're not in very good shape on these type of boards. All right, so Marchese check raises. Some people may also think in this spot, why would you want to check raise with a 4? The guy's just going to fold. Well, no, he's not, because you made it so small, right? Notice here that Tallerine has to put in 28K to win a pot that's going to be, gosh, 120. It's 28 divided by 120. Pretty good pot odds, right? 28 divided by 120 equals. Means he needs to win 23% of the time. Do you think he's going to win 23% of the time with King 7 on this board? He definitely is. Even if he has a hand like King Jack, though. If Marchese is raising a lot of his draws, like 8-5 or 8-6 or 6-5 or 6-3, then he certainly wants to raise all of these strong hands as well. Thinking back to what I just mentioned on one of the previous hands, he can have about 2-to-1 bluff ratio to value. So here, what are the nut hands Marchese would like to raise? Well, he'd like to raise Ace-4, King-4. I'm going to presume he doesn't have many of the other 4s unless they're suited that are in the middle. Then he can have maybe 7-4, 6-4, 5-4, and 4-3. So that's 7 4s. Let's call it 6 4s for, balance purposes. So 6 times 8 is 48. He has 48 nut hands, right? So if he can have 2-to-1 ratio, that means he can have about 100 bluffs. Okay, what are the bluffs? I just ran them down. Let's do it again. We have 8-6. We have 8-5. We have 6-5. We have 6-3. And we have 5-3. That is 5. Right? That's 5 hands times 16 each. 5 times 16 equals. So that's 80 combinations of bluffs. Right? He does have to have a little bit fewer bluffs than normal because he did raise somewhat small. But as you see here, if he's trying to stick to that 2-to-1 ratio, which is often close enough to right, if he can justify raising every 4 and every straight draw in this scenario and be close enough to balanced. Daniel says he should raise those to a bigger size. Well, so the problem with that is, if you raise to a bigger size with your bluffs and you raise smaller with your nuts, now you're going to be really easy to play against. Because now your opponent just knows what you have every time if they're paying attention. And I promise you, the best player in the world who he's against is paying attention. It's not like these are oblivious players we're playing against where they are not going to realize what you're doing. If they realize you're using various sizes, they're going to watch the replay and they're going to see really quickly, okay, the guy raises big with his bluffs and small with his nuts. This guy's just the worst player ever now, right? And I don't expect Marchese to be the worst player ever. I expect him to play very, very well. So you're saying maybe raise bigger with your nuts. The problem with raising bigger with your nuts is that means you need to have more bluffs to remain balanced. And what other bluffs do you necessarily want to raise with on this board? I mean, maybe you could start raising 9-8 of diamonds, but even then, like 9-8 of diamonds is probably fine enough to call for such a small bet size because it has lots of equity. The bluffs you want to raise often have almost no showdown value and somewhat little potential bluffing situations on the turn, such that you can't check call them on the flop looking to check raise the turn a lot. So I think the overcards with backdoor draws like 9-8 of spades is going to be a good hand to call with. I don't think you need to necessarily bluff that. So anyway, I think this is good. This is good and fine. On the turn, Marchese bets small. Now, he is likely ditching some of his bluffs. This is actually a pretty bad card for Marchese because if he does have a bluff, if he thinks about Tallerine's range to call the flop check raise, it should have a lot of ace highs in it, which may sound a little bit crazy to you all because, you know, I'm getting the vibe a lot of you are going to be playing this a bit tighter than most people, or most, you know, very, very high stakes players. Ace high is definitely good enough to call on the flop in spots like this. Therefore, this is a spot where Marchese should be against a lot of ace highs, and most of Marchese's draws lose to ace high. So if he's betting the turn here, he's definitely looking to bet again on the river. I would be flabbergasted if he does not bet again on the river with all of his range. This is definitely not a spot to bet the turn and then give up on the river. One thing a lot of my students have problems with is they never really know, or they have a hard time realizing when they should be betting the turn and the river or just the turn. If Marchese wanted to only bet the turn here, which I think that would be a horrible idea, but if he did want to only bet the turn, he should definitely bet much bigger because he's trying to get a 7 to fold, right? You don't want to bet small because if you bet small, your opponent's going to call you with lots of 7s. And if you're only betting one time on the turn and you're not going to bluff the river, then that's going to fail a lot of the time, right? So in general, if you're only going to be betting the turn, you want to bet bigger on the turn. If you are going to be betting the turn plus the river, you often want to be betting somewhat medium or small on the turn and then betting very big on the river. And that's the line that Marchese decided to take, and I think that's just good, solid poker. One interesting thing about this on the river, though, is that the 3 arrived. And I think that's a good reason not to overbet the river. If you think about the bluffs we just gave, well, I don't know. Let's think about this, right? Let's see if my calculator will help me here. We had, I think we had like 40, no, yeah, we had 40 nut hands. And now we have 16 additional because 6-5 gets there. So now we're up to 56 nut hands. So we had a lot of bluffs available. We had about 80 minus 16. So 64 that we could possibly be bluffing here. So that is too many. Notice he's roughly potting the river, so he needs to have 33% bluffs. So if he has 56 nut hands, you want to make this be 66% of the total pot. Or I'm sorry, of the total number of bluffs. So you do divided by 0.66 equals. So it need to be 84 hands minus your 56 value hands. So we need to come up with 29 bluffs in this scenario. We know there's 50 available, roughly. Maybe 65 available. So we can only bluff half the bluffs on the river. Notice the hands that have 3s in them maybe just picked up a hair of showdown value, so you may not want to bluff those. So 6-3 and 5-3 you may not want to bluff. So right there, that gets us down to the ones that are unpaired. That's going to be 8-5 and 8-6. So there you have it. Pretty easy. This is a spot where you can bluff those hands and then shove the straights and shove the 4s. What we just did there is actually what we do a lot over at pokercoaching.com. Every month I give a homework question where I would present a scenario like this and say, how would you play your range in each of these spots? And I would make you show me using the float the turn range analyzer how you would structure your range. If you've never seen the float the turn range analyzer, just Google it. It's great. It'll basically break down your hands by whatever proportions you're trying to figure out. I mean, like here we're just doing it on the fly. I have some experience with this, so it works okay for me, but I do understand it is a lot to take in, especially if you're not used to this type of thing at all. The goal in a lot of these spots is to be balanced, though. That is how you profit against the best players in the world, is by having a very good, fundamentally sound game. We're not going to beat these players by like running insane bluffs or whatever, making big folds, etc., etc. We're going to beat them by playing fundamentally sound. LPM says, best poker investment of your life. Pokercoaching.com. Good, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's very nice to hear. You can sign up for a free trial. I mean, don't know what you want from me. It's completely free. Free for 7 days. Then you got to pay a little bit. But I think it's going to be worth it for pretty much everyone. All right, next hand. We're 45 minutes into this, and we're only 29 minutes into the content. All right. Anyway, here we go. Negreanu raises 16K in the hijack with 4s, tolerating 3 bets to 45K on the button. Negreanu calls. This is a dicey one. So he has to put in 30 to win a 90 pot, and then he can win an additional 220. So he's getting right at the correct implied odds, assuming he thinks Tollerine is going to stack off every time. And I don't think that's going to be the case necessarily. He is going to get stacked a lot, but certainly not every time. So this is close. I think you should probably fold this against very good players from out of position. But I mean, I can't fault him for calling because he's getting very close to implied odds. All right, flop comes 9-8-4. Tolerine bets 30K. Notice again, very small bet. This is now mainly a function of his stack size. If he was deeper stacked, I can guarantee he's either checking or betting small in the spot. And given he's in position, he's probably just going to bet. But he's not going to bet. I'm sorry, he's not going to bet as small. He's going to bet something like 50K, maybe even 60 or 70K. Because he should be checking behind a lot of hands, like overcards. Negreanu just calls, which I think is interesting. The main reason not to raise here is because you're so short. So given he's so short, do you want to trap really hard? I think it's clearly fine, right? The main fear is that Tolerine has a hand like, well, kings, and the turn brings a bad card like a queen or a jack or a 10 or a 7. Or a 9 or an 8, really any of those. And then you check behind on the turn, and now you bet the river and Tolerine calls, and you don't stack him. Whereas if he does have an overpair, you're going to stack him every time. I think this may be a spot where you're going to be better off check raising small and then blasting the turn. I think that's going to get you called a lot on the flop and then put your opponent in a crappy spot on the turn a lot of the time. Notice there's a lot of draws in Negreanu. Well, the main draw is Jack 10 that Negreanu could check raise. Although, really, he may not have all the Jack 10s. He may fold Jack 10 offsuit to the 3-bet. So, I don't know. Tough spot. I probably would have just raised, but I definitely don't fault him for calling. In general, you want to raise your best draws and your draws and your best made hands. And bottom set is just like almost always in the best made hand range. If the board is anywhere near coordinated at all. Just because it's so easy for your opponent to have top pairs or over pairs and stuff like that that is going to pay you every time. So anyway, he called. Turns it 2. Tolerine continues betting because he has kings and they're at the nuts. River's a 3. Tolerine sells the nuts. He bets and gets called. Notice here, though, Negreanu check called all 3 streets out of position with the set. That is not something I would have typically expected. And if your opponent's checking sets, that makes life way more difficult because you can't get away with bluffing nearly as often. Remember how we were talking about a little while ago about how you want to, if you're bluffing very polarized, or you're betting very polarized on the river with your nut hands and your draws. Well, if your opponent has nut hands that beat your nut hands, like in this case, that makes life way more difficult because now, like right here, Tolerine thought he had the nuts, right? He's not thinking, well, I could be beat here. I mean, he realizes he could be beat, but he's not like overly concerned. The kings are squarely in his premium value range. And when you're setting up your range to be perfectly polarized, which is what a lot of the best players do, when you lose to a lot of your opponent's hands, or some of your opponent's hands, now you have to be way more careful because you can't be bluffing as much because some of your value bets are also failing. All right, let's see. Muggy says, versus a good regular, do you also need to be closer to perfectly balanced? I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. These are all good regulars, and I am suggesting to be as close to balance as possible. Unless you can find a hole in their game, right? Whenever you approach any unknown players, very often you should just start playing very fundamentally sound. The times you want to get out of line are when you know your opponents have a mistake somewhere in their games, or a hole somewhere in their games. Like some people fold too often to continuation bets, right? Against those players, get well out of line and exploit them to death because they're easy to play against. Maybe you mean in your local game? I mean, in your local game, you need to figure out what the player pool does wrong. For example, I'm part of the Poker backing company, and they'll have ideas of what the typical $10 multi-table tournament players do wrong. And if you know what the player pool does wrong, then you can certainly adjust. Like, for example, maybe your opponents call every time on the flop, or maybe they always check raise their top pairs, whatever. Anything they do wrong, you can exploit. So you say if your opponents call too much, then value bet more often, right? It's easy. If you know what your opponents do wrong, poker's often a really, really easy game because you just exploit what they're doing wrong. The problem with playing against good players is that they don't do anything wrong, or if they do something wrong, it's often very minimal and hard to see because, well, let's use myself as an example. Say someone figures out that I call the river 2% more often than is optimal because I'm a slight calling station. That's something they know that I'm doing wrong, and they can't exploit it, but they can't exploit it for much because it doesn't happen very often, right? The things that you're going to exploit when it comes to local recreational players are the very obvious things, like they fold too often to continuation bets, or they call every time versus continuation bets, right? These two players are going to be the most common you're going to play against. Their flaw takes place almost every hand they play, and it's really easy to exploit because if they never fold, stop bluffing. If they always fold, bluff every time, right? Some people may call every flop continuation bet, by the way, and then fold to almost every turn continuation bet. So those players are even more profitable because they give you a free continuation bet every time. Let's see, does Daniel Negreanu ever check raise the river out of position anymore? I don't know. You say you feel like he's removed it from his flop play. I would ask you how many hands you've played with him recently. I mean, I've played almost none, and we've been in the same tournaments. I don't know. I definitely am not egotistical enough to think that I am aware of how one of the best players in the world is going to play. Maybe if you have observed lots of these high rollers and you've seen Negreanu out of position playing many hands, thousands of them, which, I've seen 20. But if you've seen like 1,000 hands and you see that he never check raises, maybe that's a play he's decided is not good. You have to ask, why would he have decided that play is not good? Well, he thinks that his opponents are bluffing too often on the turn when he checks. Good to know, right? So that kind of thing is important. One thing I definitely suggest a lot of people do not do is try to make strong deductions about people's strategies without having a good reason or without actually talking to that person about their strategies. A lot of people like to be armchair quarterbacks in poker. Like right here, in the chat right now, we see one person saying Negreanu is playing an extremely exploitative game of never raising the turn, but now we see another player right after him, or another person right after him, saying he's very balanced. These are two very different things, right? So two people, and I don't know which one's right or wrong because I haven't watched 1,000 Daniel Negreanu hands in the last week or anything like that. But one of these two people's thoughts is very, very wrong. Or maybe he's balanced in every spot besides exactly this one because he thinks people have a hole in their game of bluffing too much. What I'm saying, though, is don't think that you have a great idea of how any player plays unless it's just really, really good. Therefore, I just play as balanced as I can and it doesn't matter what they do. Am I going to be in Montreal? I am not. Unfortunately, life is busy. All right, so anyway, Tollerine's out. 2 tables left. 5 players remain. I just got back from Florida. That was a lot of fun. All right, here are the stacks at our table. We have Kerry Katz, 52K. Dan Smith, 320K. Marchese, 585K. Negreanu, 785K. Royal Freeman says, best poker strategy is GTO. Try to figure out why that may or may not be accurate. I'm writing a book on game theory, by the way, with Michael Acevedo. I'm looking really forward to that. I'll spoil it a bit for you. If you play GTO, you're going to break even or win. If you play exploitative, you're either going to win a ton or lose a ton. And that's important to realize. If your opponents are actually bad, playing GTO is a humongous mistake, like a detrimental error. But if your opponents are anywhere near competent and capable of adjusting when they find a hole in their game, then you're way better off just playing very close to GTO. GTO cannot be exploited, just so you know. That is the definition of GTO, is it is unexploitable. I think a lot of people like to throw around these terms without really understanding what they mean. And I certainly don't even protest to you. Or I do not assume that I am anywhere near a GTO player. And I also do not I realize that I am not, I have no like PhDs in math or anything like this. My wife has a theoretical math degree, but I do not. And I'm far from a math genius. That's why I outsource my work to actual math geniuses like Michael Acevedo, who I'm writing the GTO book with. It's important to realize that you do not know everything. Daniel says, no one plays perfect GTO. Interestingly enough, Michael has the game solved on his computer. It's just a matter of actually implementing it. What does the T stand? Game Theory Optimal. This is not meant to be a game theory stream, but I guess if we continue having questions about it, we can address it. All right. Blinds, here we are. We have it at the top. All right, 7K big blind. Smith raises to 17K on the button. Negreanu calls. Jack 7 offsuit in the big blind. This is fine. Notice, though, that Smith made it a hair bigger now that there's one less player at the table. So that's interesting. Flop becomes 7, 5, 2. Negreanu leads 11K. All right. Typical situations where you want to lead in this scenario are when the board is very low and coordinated. Is this board low and coordinated? Well, it is. So this is a reasonable spot for Negreanu to lead with his draws and strong made hands. However, I'm not really sure I like this sizing because unless his plan is to bet small, blast the river with a lot of his bluffs, it's going to be tough to price your opponent out. Like, notice when he bets 11K on the flop, whatever his opponent has is usually getting very close to the right price to call. So I don't really know what's happening here. Let's just observe. All right, he bets 11K. Smith obviously calls. Well, I say obviously calls. Notice Smith has queen of diamonds, jack of spades with overcards and a backdoor flush draw. This is definitely good enough. So very, very easy call. Turns an ace, and now Negreanu bets again. And this is where I really don't like this because I think this bet would be good against a player who is not a good player, who is basically never going to raise you as a bluff and who is very frequently going to raise you if they have an ace. Now, I've played a decent chunk with Dan Smith, and Dan Smith is a very, very good loose aggressive player. This is the type of player who can raise you with bluffs, and also the type of player who realizes here the ace should be very good for Dan Smith's range and very bad for Negreanu's range. So when Negreanu bets here, he should expect to get raised a lot. So he does bet small again, and he gets raised. When he bets small, he actually should expect to get raised because small bets often indicate marginal made hands, like exactly what he has. And if I know you have a marginal made hand on a turn that should be good for my range, well, I should be raising you a ton, right? So this is a spot where I think Smith's play is perfectly fine, but I definitely do not like Negreanu's turn lead. I should try to get him on the line and ask him what's going on with these hands, because I definitely do not like this one. I think he'd be much better off just check calling flop. I do get, from a GTO point of view, you want to deny equity. If you can deny equity for an 11K bet in this scenario and make all the overcards fold, sure, that plays great. But I can guarantee you Smith's not folding any overcards for 11K, and no one who's competent is going to fold any overcards for 11K. Let's see. What would be the best line here for Dan? Well, call the flop bet clearly and raise the turn. I think this was a very, very good strategy. Let's see. Does this mean that we should be calling more marginal made hands in this situation? If you lead in this spot as Negreanu and get raised, you need to be very clear of what your range looks like. Because unless you're leading with your sets and your two pairs as well, you're definitely going to be folding too often. And Negreanu may not be leading sets and two pairs. So if he's not leading sets and two pairs, that means this is very near the top of his range. He may have ace-3 and ace-4, but I don't know why you'd want to bluff those necessarily on the flop. So, yeah, I just think this is a spot where Negreanu has to be aware that he should be getting bluffed a lot. And if he's getting bluffed a lot, he has to defend a lot. If we know people will attack it, bet call has to make more money than check call. Well, you don't want to play for all your money in this spot, though, right? Like, when you have this hand, you would prefer to just get to showdown when the turn brings a very bad card for your range. And maybe he thought that he would rarely get raised, but Dan Smith is a real aggressive player. So I do not think that that's going to work out too well in this spot most of the time.